Hi, this is Helen from Jupiter's Realm, and in this episode I'm looking at retrograde planets in astrology. So what being retrograde is technically, and then what a planet being retrograde symbolises, as well as some useful ways to approach managing retrograde transits, and also what a retrograde planet in your birth chart might signify. Now, all the planets go retrograde at some point during their cycle around the Sun. From the earliest days of astrology, being retrograde has been taken note of as part of the assessment of a planet's condition. You're probably familiar with hearing about Mercury retrogrades in astrology, which are often talked about in terms of irritations and disruptions or difficulty, but that doesn't always have to be that case, which I'll touch on later. Now, to understand why retrogrades have this meaning, it's helpful to explore what a retrograde planet is doing astronomically, so let's get into that first. Now, in a 24-hour period, we see the Sun and planets moving from east to west in the sky because of the Earth's rotation. But all the planets in reality have an anti-clockwise orbit around the Sun. So if you watch the sky for longer than 24 hours, you'll see they're actually gradually moving west to east over time, which is called prograde or forward motion in astronomy. And this is the normal direction that planets move over time from our perspective here on Earth. So in an astrology chart, this is represented by the planets and luminaries moving likewise in an anti-clockwise direction through the chart wheel, and the zodiac goes in the same direction as well. A retrograde planet is one that appears to be moving backwards in the opposite direction to this normal motion through the zodiac, so going contrary to its normal path. Now, the planets aren't actually moving backwards through space. That's just an optical illusion due to the different speeds of the planet's orbits around the Sun and our perspective of that from Earth. The root of the word retrograde is the Latin retrogradus from retrograde, retro meaning backwards and grade meaning step, so to step backwards. The Greek word used by ancient astrologers was anapodizo, which has the same essential meaning as well as meaning to call back or to re-examine. Now, in each planet cycle, there will be a point where it appears to slow down in speed and stop, although of course it's not actually stopping in space. Now, this stop point is called its station. After stationing, that's when the planet then appears to start moving backwards, now moving clockwise over time through the sky and in an astrology chart. And that is what is meant when we talk about a planet being retrograde. Eventually, the planet slows down again and stations for a second time, after which it will start moving in the normal anti-clockwise direction again, which is called going direct. In reality, planets don't move in a simple back and forth movement as it appears in a chart, but in more of a loop or even a zigzag motion. But the key point is that a retrograde planet is one that appears to be moving backwards against its normal prograde motion. All the planets in astrology, except for the Moon, have a retrograde phase, so I'll just run through those for each of the planets. Now, Mercury goes retrograde 3 or 4 times a year, roughly 3 weeks sort of span at a time. Venus goes retrograde every 18 months or so for roughly 6 weeks. Mars every 26 months for roughly a 2 to 3 month period. Jupiter goes retrograde roughly every 9 months for about 4 months. And then Saturn, Uranus and Neptune go retrograde just over every 12 months. Saturn's retrograde period lasts for about 4.5 months, Uranus for 5 months, and Neptune just over 5 months. And then Pluto goes retrograde once a year for approximately 5 to 6 months. So Venus and Mars go retrograde for shorter periods and less frequently than the other planets, which can make their effects more noticeable when they do. And the outer planet retrogrades can be more experientially subtle. Because a retrograde planet is moving contrary to its normal direction, the common interpretation in astrology is that the planet can indicate disruption to the normal flow of events, or setbacks or challenges. The station points were traditionally considered the most notable part of the retrograde phase. At the stations, the planets are at their slowest speed and are also closer to the Earth and brighter, which intensifies the planet's retrograde significance. The speed of a planet is a consideration as to how effective and quickly it can bring about its significations. Forward direction with average or faster than average speed is usually considered more favourable in astrology. A planet that's moving slower than its daily average speed is considered less effective, or that its significations will take longer to manifest. So now we've covered what's happening when a planet goes retrograde, let's have a deeper look at what some of the significations of a planet being retrograde is. Retrogrades as indications of difficulty make sense symbolically in terms of the planets moving counter to their standard direction. Moving backwards in life isn't generally considered positive or supporting progress. We tend to think of progress more as moving forward or aiming for what's ahead of us. And things going in the opposite direction to what we're expecting or to the norm can feel frustrating, discordant or out of sync. It can sometimes feel confusing, unsettling or disruptive. You thought things were moving in a particular direction and now all of a sudden there's a U-turn. And that might not be what you want or what you're prepared for. And slowness or inactivity isn't generally prized as something that helps us achieve our goals or satisfaction. Although I think in some contexts that's slowly starting to change. But on the whole, retrogrades are interpreted as indicating sort of frustrations or challenges. The slowing down of planets and backward movement is associated with delay, having to renegotiate, review or revise matters, having second thoughts or having to retrace your steps in some way. Or it can be matters from the past arising or looking back to the past. It can also be about reversal, loss, diminishment or weakening, or something being taken back or held back. As Astrology of Retrograde says from the Mark T. Riley translation, if the stars are found past the first stationary point and are found to be retrograde, they delay expectations, actions, profits and enterprises. But going backwards, slowing down or making U-turns isn't always inherently a bad thing or causing a difficult outcome. For example, pausing a project to go over it, to revise and update it could be a worthwhile thing to do, preventing issues arising down the line, rather than just steaming ahead. I think context is essential, both in a general sense and in relation to the birth chart. In some situations, a retrograde transit can turn out to be quite helpful. A Venus retrograde, for example, can sometimes be about revisiting enjoyable creative pursuits from the past or reconnecting with friends from the past that you've lost touch with. A Mercury retrograde might signify a contract being held up, which might initially be frustrating, but in the end it gives you time to notice errors or parts that need to be renegotiated, which could turn out to be for the better. Or if a retrograde brings up matters from the past, this can allow the opportunity to address how to engage with that in a more beneficial way, or to resolve any associated challenges. And keep in mind that what planets in your birth chart the transiting retrograde planet is aspecting, or which birth chart house it's going through and the condition of the ruler of that house, that these are important factors in how you might personally experience a retrograde. Pause or delay can also provide the opportunity for reflection or introspection, and that can be really useful in bringing us insights that might otherwise have been missed. Retrogrades can also indicate a more internal or inward focus arising, or pause or delay can provide the opportunity for reflection or introspection. It can also indicate a change of mind, the reversing of ideas, perspectives or opinions, so to speak. There's also an association with a rebellious kind of nature, not conforming to the norm. As ancient astrologer Sar ibn Bashir puts it, in Ben Dyke's translation of his work, a retrograding planet indicates disobedience, collapse, meaning revolt or impairment, repetition and disagreement. A planet being at its first station, just before it starts retrograding, can be interpreted as the planet challenging the rules, conventions or what's expected. So whatever it signifies being done in an unusual or contrary way. That could indicate discord or conflict in a matter, but of course for who will be a matter of perspective, and again context is important. There might be situations where going against the grain is needed or ultimately beneficial, depending on what's trying to be achieved. Although of course doing that might still ruffle feathers, making a situation tricky to navigate. Conversely, if something is difficult as a normal mode of operation, the planet going retrograde can signify that becoming easier, or at least allowing space to find ways to manage whatever it is that's been challenging. Now you may be wondering, well, what if I have a retrograde planet in my birth chart? What does that mean? Well, if you have a retrograde planet in your chart, it can indicate similar themes. So, for example, what the planet signifies manifesting in an unconventional or unique way, or that perhaps comes across as rebellious in some way. Topics the planet represents in terms of its own nature or the houses it rules may be delayed in their manifestation, taking more time to develop, coming about later in life, or there might be a change to the direction to those topics are moving at some point through transit activation or through progressions. Alternatively, you may find that the topics the planet represents for you may progress at a slower pace compared to other parts of life, or in a quieter or more internal way. But what's more significant is if a planet has stationed 7 days before or after your birth, since the station points are potent parts of the retrograde cycle, bringing more intensity and focus to the planet. Now, a planet stationing the second time and going direct is associated with improvements. For example, Vetis Valens writes, if they are at or past the second stationary point, they cancel any delay and reinstate the same activities. They then bring stability and success in the life. And Saal says, if it was stationing towards direct motion, it indicates forward movement in that matter with no difficulty. So we see here the idea of a retrograde planet bringing instability, and then when it goes direct, things feel like they're getting back to normal, getting back on track, getting moving again in a more familiar and stable fashion. So this part of the phase can be indicative of things flowing along again in a way that feels more natural or familiar, or being able to overcome any setbacks or challenges experienced under the retrograde phase and make progress with some forward momentum again. So to recap, during a retrograde transit, things might slow down, be delayed, be revoked or reversed, or go in a different direction than expected, U-turns being made. It can indicate sometimes frustrations or challenges. But not all retrograde transits are challenging per se, and the context of your own birth chart is an important factor influencing how you personally experience a retrograde transit. When retrograde transits happen, consider the R words as keywords for possible ways that show up. So having to review, reflect, revise, reconsider, repetition, renegotiate, return, reverse, rediscover, reconnect, or even rebellion. Sometimes there can be a pattern or thread that comes up, a theme around what the planet represents, or the house that it's going through, that's actually a continuation from a previous retrograde cycle to work through. So sometimes it can be helpful to look back to previous retrogrades of the same kind for a potential flavour of the kind of topics or matters that could be coming up. Not always, but sometimes that can be the case. I think it's helpful to consider also that retrograde transit periods can offer an opportunity to reflect on or pay closer attention to what's happening, perhaps to something that you might otherwise have missed or taken for granted, and that there may be other perspectives to be gained, or more knowledge or information to be gathered during this time, which can ultimately benefit you once things start moving forward again. Generally, it can be helpful to allow some room for flexibility where possible to make adjustments to the changing circumstances, but also to manage expectations and cultivate patience during this time if you can. That can go a long way to making retrograde transit periods more manageable and productive. So I hope that's given you a helpful understanding and overview of what a planet being retrograde means in astrology. If you have any questions or comments, please do let me know. And if you have any retrograde stories yourself or examples that you'd like to share, please do leave them in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll speak to you again soon.